Hi everybody, thank you for coming out today. My name is Nick Marshall. I'm the manager of exhibitions and public programs here at the George Eastman Museum. The Focus 45 series is a monthly series of talks on one Saturday a month that presents different projects going on around the museum, whether it's by staff or researchers who are utilizing the collection for their own work. It kind of gives our audiences a glimpse into what are the things that happen behind closed doors here. What are the things that, you know, we have all of our great exhibitions and displays, but there's so much other stuff going on at the museum. So today's talk is with Jesse Pierce, and I'm going to ask Gabby Connor to come up here in a second to do a quick introduction for Jesse, but I just wanted to remind everyone that next month, on April 6th, is going to be our next Focus 45. And that's actually going to be with me. This is the first Focus 45 I've done, and I've been overseeing this series for almost 5 years now. So, and I'm going to be talking with one of my colleagues, Emily Phoenix, who is our chief object preparator. We're going to be talking about the other half of my job, the exhibition side of things. We're going to be giving kind of a behind-the-scenes glimpse of what goes on to put together an exhibition, a lot of behind-the-scenes photos of some of our installs, of some of the more complicated shows that we've done. It's some really cool videos and stuff that'll be included in it. So please come out on April 6th for that talk as well. So for now, I'll turn it over to Kathy, and we'll get moving along. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. You're all in for a real treat. Nick, I think we do need a few more chairs because there's people standing. There is one right up front here and one right in the center, if you don't mind sitting separately. Okay. For those that I don't know, and I know most of you in the crowd, my name is Gabby Connor, and I'm the curator of the George Eastman Legacy and the Landscape Collections here at the George Eastman Museum. One of my key things is to work with Jesse Pierce, your speaker today. He is the archivist in the collection. He has the privilege of reading George Eastman's letters on a regular basis, cataloging them, accessioning them, and now putting them into our database. And we're now really in full swing trying to get them all digitized and online so people even outside of Rochester can access them. He does this talk in sort of conjunction with the Dutch Connection exhibition every year, our flower show. That's done. We have a few flowers left in the Pound House, but for the most part, that's done. But it's our look back at what George Eastman was doing 100 years ago. Okay, so this year, 2019, he's going to talk about what Eastman was involved with in 1919. Now, Jesse has a BA in history from St. John Fisher College. He also has a museum studies certificate from that same school. In addition to working here, Jesse is also an avid bicyclist. If you don't see the big bicycle with the fat tires that's parked every day at our side door, our porte-cochere entrance, he literally goes back and forth to work every day, even in this inclement weather, with this big bike. And he teaches bike safety in our community. One thing you might not know about Jesse is that he's an avid genealogist as well, and he's been working on his family genealogy for many years. Jesse is married to a lovely wife, Sarah, who is here in the audience today and has two wonderful kids, both McKenzie and Aiden, who I was thrilled came today to listen to their dad speak. And it is my pleasure, as always, to introduce my friend and colleague, Jesse Pierce.
Good crowd. Thanks everybody for coming today. Aiden and McKenzie, I hope you stay awake. So this is always fun. I actually will be celebrating my 9th anniversary here at George Eastman Museum next month, which means that this is my 9th time taking a year-by-year look at George Eastman's life. So the years 1911 to 1919, 1920, I know very well, and every year I do this exhibit examining what Eastman was up to 100 years prior. And in past years when I've done this talk and this exhibit, there really hasn't been a convenient, easy, overarching theme for each particular year. But this year there is, and it's expansion, and I hope that becomes evident in the slides that follow. I did want to point out the picture here of Eastman in September 1919. You can it's kind of hard to see, but he has a mustache, and the last picture I see of him with a mustache was in the 1890s. So he even started experimenting with the mustache in 1919. But let's get started. This is a very packed presentation. If we could save all the questions to the end, I think it would go pretty smooth that way. So who here was here last year for the 1918 presentation? I'm just curious. So last year I talked about his last day was his New Year's Eve party that he had thrown. And remember, the war was over. The armistice was signed. The details of the Treaty of Versailles were still being worked out, but the war was over. And Rochester was jubilant. The country was jubilant. George Eastman was jubilant. And he threw a big party at the end of the year 1918. Eastman had many parties here at his mansion. And this, out of all the parties that he ever threw, that's the one that I would most want to be at. It was just this jubilant celebration that the war was over, the boys were going to come home. They had this opera singer, Richard Benelli, that came. They projected movies and war footage onto the wall in the conservatory, and the organist had a mirror right next to the organ console, and he was looking back at the movies being shown on the other wall so we could play music along to it. They had 130 guests, many young people. At midnight, Rush Reese, the president of University of Rochester, made this impassioned speech about the end of the war and better days to come, and they danced past 3 a.m. So that spirit not only carries into 1919, but of course it carries into the Roaring 20s. So it's like you go straight from World War I to the Roaring 20s, and it's just an expanded horizons year to talk about. So again, the war was over. George Eastman was very optimistic going into 1919, optimistic in regard to the future. As I discussed at length last year, Kodak was involved in a variety of war efforts. They made gas masks, periscopes, eyeglasses, all sorts of things that were used in the war effort. With the end of the war, they obviously stopped making those things, and they could go back to making a lot of their consumer products that they really couldn't make when they were making munitions for the government. And Eastman therefore expected business to boom right away. And he looked forward to the period of Reconstruction, and he very much looked forward to the USA seizing the opportunity and kind of penetrating the world with its products. So that's another level of this expanded horizons, was just with Kodak penetrating foreign markets after the war. So a big theme of 1919 was the returning soldiers. Eastman joined a local committee to arrange for the reception and entertainment of returning soldiers, and that parade that you see there on the left is a Rochester parade. And then George Eastman did make a special trip down to New York City. He rented a second floor story building overlooking this parade of Union Square because he wanted to see the troops returning there, parading under the Triumphal Arch. So the returning soldiers was an important part of 1919. So Kodak did have to tweak its messaging with the war being over. One of the main focuses of advertising during the World War I years was Kodak was encouraging mostly women on the home front to send, images to their boys overseas to boost their morale. With the war being over, they had to tweak that messaging a bit. And as you can see from this advertisement here, the message was to document the return of the soldiers. You see in that advertisement there, that day will never come again. The boys returning home is worth far more than merely seeing. It is worth saving. And that was very much Kodak's emphasis with their products, was document your family's lives. Never stop taking pictures of your children, of these important moments that you can preserve forever. So that was a big focus of their 1919 marketing. So from what I have gathered, there were 555 men that left Kodak Park employment to join the service. Kodak really did a stand-up thing, and they promised those people jobs upon their return. Maybe not their specific job that they had had, but they did promise them a job back with the company after the war. And not only did Kodak fulfill that promise, but they also employed many returning veterans that had not worked at Kodak previously. And again, because of the war work that Kodak Park was doing during the war years, they had suspended the daily tour of Kodak Park. but with the end of the war in early 1919, George Strutt there, who was the quintessential Kodak Park tour guide, he got to resume those tours at Kodak Park. So things were getting back to normal once again. In the fall of 1919, they had a memorial tablet erected over at Kodak Park dedicated to the 14 Kodak employees who died over in Europe. I stole this picture off the internet. I think this is in Theater on the Ridge. Has anybody seen this tablet at Theater on the Ridge? I'm not positive it's still there, but you think it is, Bob? All right.
I don't know if it's still there. It used to be mounted outdoors.
Yeah.
Behind Building 26.
Yep.
And then it disappeared, and then it showed up in 28.
Oh, interesting. So on the sides there, you see the 555 names of the men who entered the service, and then in that center piece, the in memoriam piece, you see the names of the 14 Kodak employees who did die for their country. And so apparently that's still up at Kodak Park at Building 28 at outside the Theater of the Ridge. I do want to talk a moment about the League of Nations. Of course, President Woodrow Wilson, Democrat President Woodrow Wilson, that was one of his 14 points at the end of World War I. He wanted there to be this United Nations-like League of Nations. And initially, as you can see from the article there on the right, George Eastman at the beginning of the year was for the League of Nations. He is being reported in the papers as being one of these big businessmen that favor the League of Nations. Opposition was confined largely to those of restricted outlook, and we know that Eastman did not have a restricted outlook. But as the details of that League of Nations were worked out, Eastman flipped. He became opposed to the U.S. entering the League of Nations under those specific clauses. And George Eastman loved the idea of preserving peace. He liked the idea of the United States providing aid. But ultimately, George Eastman supported the Lodge reservations, which was, that was a scheme by the Massachusetts Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. If you want to Google that sometime, look up the Lodge reservations. It was a bunch of Republicans in Congress that were willing to join the League of Nations, but with these reservations, and George Eastman did support those reservations. Eastman and other Republicans didn't want the U.S. acting as a policeman for Europe and Asia. They didn't want the League potentially forcing America to enter the war without congressional approval. And there was some thinking that, this was President Wilson's excursion into internationalism, and they didn't like that. I do have a letter here. Are these the letters? I'll pass this around. And basically, George Eastman, it's very hard sometimes to get George Eastman's specific opinion on something, but this is a letter that his good friend Otto Kahn wrote in November 19. And out of all the letters that opposed the United States joining the League of Nations, Eastman called this letter the clearest and most convincing statement of the issue. So I can pass this around. You can also look at it afterwards, but those are the specific reasons that Eastman did not want the United States entering the League of Nations with those specific provisions. After the war, one of the organizations that was put together was the Aerial Photographers Association, and George Eastman was elected as an honorary member in 1919 due to Kodak's development of aerial photography, due to the Aerial School of Photography up at Kodak Park. So Eastman was very honored to be considered an honorary member of that organization. And Eastman was supremely honored to get an individual letter from Edward Steichen. Steichen was one of the most foremost photographers in the world, a renowned modernist photographer. And this is the only letter we have from Edward Steichen to George Eastman. And he has awful handwriting. But it says, "Dear Mr. Eastman, please accept the overseas prints as an expression of appreciation of the distinguished services and generous support rendered by yourself and the personnel of the Kodak Company in the development of American aerial photography in connection with the war." So we do have that little note on display upstairs on the second floor if you want to check that out. Not only do we have a letter thanking Eastman from Edward Steichen, but we've also got this really neat letter from Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you know anything about World War I, you know that it took America a very long time to mobilize. It took a long time for us to get our act together. And because the Navy was short of binoculars and spyglasses and telescopes, they put out this call for Eyes for the Navy, for people to donate their binoculars and similar items for the war effort. Eastman ended up donating 2 of his personal binoculars for the war effort. They were returned to him when the war was done, and he got 2 letters, 2 identical signed letters from Franklin D. Roosevelt. So that was, of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt was then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He went on to become New York State Governor, of course went on to become President. But Eastman and FDR knew each other starting with the World War I war effort. And they stayed in touch over the next 13 years. So getting back to Kodak, getting back to normal, when they were going to resume their consumer products, they realized that they had an unprecedented demand for female help. And so what they did is they sent representatives to nearby towns, Medina, Elmira, Albion, all these surrounding towns, to get women to come to Rochester to work for Kodak. At the time, Rochester was experiencing a pretty severe housing shortage, and they didn't want that to be an impediment to any of the girls coming Rochester's way. So they had a Kodak department expressly devoted to finding housing for these girls attracted to Rochester. So we have this really neat scrapbook in our display case this year that it's a summary of the work done in the surrounding towns in order to attract them to Rochester. There on the screen you see an Elmira, New York advertisement, but they realized they needed about 250 girls and very quick to keep up with demand. So one of the thorns in George Eastman's side during this time was the government lawsuit. Kodak was charged with having a monopoly. This was the trust-busting era, and the government was in the midst of suing Kodak, charging them with having a monopoly when the United States entered the war. So when the war was going on, that lawsuit was put on hold, but when the war was over, that lawsuit started up again and again. It did not end well for Kodak. Kodak eventually had to sell off some of its divisions, which was a disappointment to Eastman, but he learned to live with it. But throughout 1919, he had to go down to New York City a lot to testify. He did have a plan to go to Europe in the summer of 1919, but he was not able to because he had to go back and forth in order to offer his testimony. But again, this government lawsuit went against Kodak eventually. We'll talk about that in a few years. So during, I have job security with these guys. So in 1917, Eastman had helped run the Red Cross fundraising drive in order to raise funds for the Red Cross. The following year, 1918, I talked about this in last year's presentation, the decision was made to bunch all of these fundraising drives together for the Red Cross, for other national organizations, for local charities. They just decided to have one big drive, combined effort, and they called that the War Chest. And it was very successful. Rochester was one of the most successful cities in the country with their War Chest. And Eastman's hope was that even with the ending of the war, he hoped that that War Chest would continue. And it did. It ended up becoming the Community Chest, which is today's United Way. So they did another campaign in the spring of 1919, and it was not as successful. I mean, the war was done. People really didn't feel into it as much with the war being over. But they did raise $1.25 million. According to Eastman, he said everyone was pretty well satisfied. We scraped through. But Eastman was a little disappointed in his Kodak employees. He says that half gave, and those who donated gave half of what they were capable of. Sounds like that line out of Lord of the Rings with the Hobbit. But a lot of people felt pressure to contribute. There were managers that were pushing their employees to buy Liberty bonds, to contribute to the War Chest, and if you didn't, you were kind of ostracized. I don't know if that necessarily came from Eastman, but it was part of that corporate culture that if you worked here, you had a responsibility to help fundraise. So I am 9 years removed from being in college, and I'm about to talk about socialism, communism, Bolshevism, and these are generalizations that I hope I'm getting right, but I do feel the need to differentiate between these different movements as we talk about the labor relations and industrial relations that we're about to talk with. So socialism in general, again, this is in general, is the idea of redistributing wealth, leveling the playing field a bit to promote equality and hopefully to eliminate social classes. The communists wanted to abolish private property, in which the working class would own everything. And then you have Bolshevism, which they wanted a violent overthrow to bring about that revolution. So there is a little bit of a differentiation. I think sometimes 100 years removed, we can kind of blend all these things together, but they were kind of separate. And one of the neat figures that I encountered while looking through George Eastman's correspondence was Catherine Breshkovsky. Has anyone heard of her before? I don't blame you, I had not heard of her either. But in Russia, she is popularly known as the babushka, the grandmother of the Russian Revolution. She helped co-found the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which they were peacefully opposing the Tsar. She believed that the salvation of Russia really lied in educating children to be good citizens, primarily orphan children. She was a political prisoner who opposed the Bolsheviks, and she was forced to flee the country when they took power. She was a socialist revolutionary, but in the United States, she was actually looked at very kindly. She did go on a tour of the country. She did visit Rochester briefly. Eastman was not present. He was down at his hunting retreat when she came through Rochester, but he did express in letters that he wished he could have met her when she came through the area, and he picked out a camera for her. So again, he had this socialist revolutionary, but Rochester and the elite Rochesterians of his day really did look up to Catherine Breshkovsky. So she's a character that you can look up when you get home, maybe. But all this industrial relations push that was happening at the time, it was done because of the rise of Bolshevism, right? Those in the corporate world, those in the political world just feared that, overthrow of the ruling elites coming to America. And Eastman did anticipate that as that happened, labor conditions would grow more difficult. And to preempt that, he wanted Kodak to be a leader, not a follower, when it came to industrial relations. He wanted Kodak at the top in respect to industrial relations. And so he spent a good part of 1919 researching what we would call benchmarking, getting in touch with other companies that he admired, seeing what their welfare policies were. And there was a study done in 1919 that found that Kodak employees were overall dissatisfied with their present wages. But Kodak got their managers together to talk about employee relations. They had dinners to impress upon these managers the Kodak ideals. They also met with common workers, and ultimately this new industrial relations department under W.H. Cameron was established in 19. And in order to get to the next level and to preempt and prevent this rise of Bolshevism sympathies in his ranks, Eastman did two things. He used a carrot and he used a stick, all right? So the carrot, which he wisely did first, was his stock distribution scheme of 1919. And as you see there, the first bullet point, I think this is worth talking about for a minute. 1918, 1919, George Eastman thinks that he doesn't have much longer left. And I'm not positive what that is, but in 1918, he writes his niece Ellen in Chicago, and he says, look, if something happens to me, I want you to see it through that the School of Music is housed in my house on East Avenue. So it's something that a lot of people don't know, but the original vision that he had, at least at this time, was to have his East Avenue mansion house the Eastman School of Music. Eventually that didn't happen, and he found other quarters, but the other part here is he says in March 1919, I am so discouraged about the prospect of dying soon that he decides to expedite the distribution of his stock among loyal Kodak employees. So he doesn't get rid of all of his stock, but this is about a third of George Eastman's stock. And what he does is he gives it to Kodak employees at par. So he didn't give it to them, they had to buy it, but they bought it at par, and it was doled out in proportion to the employee's time of service. And the money derived from the sale of those shares went to part of a new welfare fund that was established for the benefit of all employees. And that fund was administered by a committee half composed of factory managers and half composed of common workers. And Eastman was very smart. He knew that to get their cooperation, he wanted to make them partners in the business. He wanted them to go to work every single day feeling that they had a vested interest in the success of the company. So what was employees' reaction to the stock distribution scheme. I love this cartoon that appeared in their internal employee magazine. You just see like the dollar signs in their eyes, right? $6 million worth of stock available to them. And as you can see from the gentlemen in their reclining chairs in the lower right, it meant cars and it meant homes. That's what it meant when they got this stock. Now for the stick. All right, so 4 months after distributing that stock, George Eastman issues quite a stark, poignant letter to Kodak employees. Every employee in the company received this circular letter in which Eastman expounds on the dangers of Bolshevism. He warns them about the poison of anarchy, of mob control, and he really tells them that Kodak's success and the employees' comfort and prosperity are intertwined. He assures them that working conditions will improve, but that requires mutual confidence and cooperation, which would ultimately give them loyalty and prosperity. This letter is on display on the second floor in that exhibit case, but he ends this letter, again, very starkly, saying, it's up to you. It's in your hands to strangle it, pull its fangs, kill it, meaning Bolshevism and anarchy, and I have faith that you will. Just a very, very poignant, very kind of harsh letter in which he really lays down the law. And how do employees respond this time? I was actually very moved with the response by Kodak employees. What they do is there are many, many Kodak departments that collectively essentially pledge their allegiance. They disavow anarchy, Bolshevism, socialism, etc. They ensure their support as true Americans. We actually have 4 or 5 letters like this that just go on and on with individual names from workers in the Kodak company, just assuring Eastman of their support. So I think if he would have done the warning letter and then the stop scheme, it might not have been so good. But now that they were owners in the company, it went really well. So he knew what he was doing. And I did want to, I think this slide is important. Sometimes I think we can over-idealize Eastman a bit, but the fact is that he was human and his opinions changed. And what his opinion was on a particular subject, it really depended on when you asked him. You know, he knew sometimes to bow to the inevitable. Sometimes I think he would do it with, you know, gritted teeth. He wasn't too happy about it. But nonetheless, you know, these reforms in industrial relations happened. And again, some of them he might not have been too happy with, but he bowed to the inevitable and made these changes. And C.E. Kenneth Meese, who was one of his close friends, he was in charge of the research labs at Kodak Park. One of the greatest things that we have up in our archive is this collection of reminiscences. 15 or 20 years after Eastman's passing, Oscar Silbert performed these oral interviews with really close friends of his, really close business colleagues, and he amasses all these great stories that you would not get in any other way. And Dr. Meese recalls Mr. Eastman as a public speaker, an activity to which shyness prevented him from being at his best. He really dreaded public speaking. Once in 1919, when the subject of Bolshevism was a live topic, he made a wonderful speech on the subject to a group of foremen at Kodak Park. It lasted 3 minutes and was printed in Kodak magazine. I think that's the letter that I just showed you, that pull its fangs, kill it letter. The closing words were, it's up to you. Mr. Eastman, after the talk, asked Dr. Meese his opinion of it and was told it was very poor and all nonsense. He chided, you let L.B. Jones write that speech for you instead of you thinking and speaking for yourself. So in Eastman, or in Meese's opinion, Eastman didn't write that letter. It was an advertising agent, L.B. Jones. At that time, Mr. Eastman was much concerned for this country. One of his theories was that wages should come down. In politics and economics, Mr. Eastman was a conservative, although intellectually, Dr. Meese believes he was a profound radical. Financially, he was very conservative and of the banker type. He was not the type in later years to take risks, although he undoubtedly did so in his youth. So a few slides ago, I mentioned that there was a study that found that Kodak employees were dissatisfied with their wages. At that very same time, according to Meese, Eastman thought that wages should come down. So again, there's this tension in, Eastman being enlightened and becoming a better employer. I just want to convey this afternoon that it happened in degrees, all right? You just didn't wake up one morning and say, I just want to be the best employer in the world. It happened by degrees, and that shows his humanness, that he was willing to take in new information, assess it, and sometimes bow to the inevitable. But people often ask me, would you want to work for George Eastman? And my answer is always, it depends when, Early in the Kodak days, Eastman was that boss that stood outside the bathroom, timing how long you were in there. Would I want to be an employee in the early Kodak days? No, I don't think any of us would. But would I want to work for Kodak in the 1920s and the 1930s? Absolutely. So there is a difference and a profound shift that happens. And again, that's all of us, that's human. So I wanted to stress that this afternoon. So one of the things that he did is the Kodak Park Athletic Association, they established, just to get some more camaraderie, they established a noon-hour baseball game every day. Every day when you went to Kodak, you would take your lunch and there would be a baseball game outside. And you didn't have to participate, you could just go and watch, but they did that to build camaraderie. They also established a beach house up at Lake Ontario so that Kodak employees could take their kids to the beach, and for a simple 15-cent charge, you could check in your valuables and get a towel and all that. But again, they're just going that extra mile to make their employees happy. Eastman did establish the first field day of Kodak. They had a field day on Saturday, October 4th at Exposition Park, which is now Edgerton Park. And all the different buildings and factories of Kodak and individual departments had picnics before, but this was the first big one. At the time, I think Rochester had about 8,000 or 9,000 Kodak employees, and this was the first big event for all of them when they were expected to bring their families, and as a result, it was the biggest event that Kodak had put on for its employees up to that point. Over 30,000 people showed up at Edgerton Park for athletic events, speeches, entertainment, food, prizes, and we have some pictures here. You see a cartoon there on the left, and then a picture of the grandstand there. Games, tug of war, it was just a beautiful October day, and employees had a great time that you can see from these pictures. I did want to mention real quickly, we do have an information file in our area about accidents that happened up at Kodak Park. This was one of them. There was a young girl, her name was Marion Logan, and a flask of acid exploded and burned her on August 15th, 1919. Eastman really did take a personal interest in her care afterwards. This wasn't some HR person taking care of her. Eastman was sending her regular checks, checking in on her, making sure she was okay. I think Marion did need multiple plastic surgeries, but they stayed in touch. And many years later, 5 years later, Marion thanks Eastman for all the care that he had given her for the past 5 years. She even invites him to her wedding. Eastman can't attend, but he sends her a wedding present. And that just shows Eastman's character. He was a good boss. He cared about his people. As far as Eastman's personal life, the biggest blow that he experienced, the most significant event of 19, was the death of Colonel Henry Strong. Strong was very much a father figure in Eastman's life. When Eastman was a banker, when he was young and wanted to go into photography full-time, into business full-time, he needed capital, and that capital came from Henry Strong. And over the course of Kodak's history, George Eastman remained treasurer of Kodak, whereas president of Kodak was Henry Strong, Eastman's father figure, mentor, and initial investor. And they were very close. They were extremely close. Some of the banter back and forth with their letters, particularly in the early years, is just really funny and sweet. But Eastman said, "A more staunch ally never existed. I shall miss him very much." And so it is in 1919 that Eastman does finally get to be president of Kodak after the passing of Colonel Henry Strong. But that shook Eastman up quite a bit. To switch gears, let's talk about music. Eastman, was a very creative, energy person. He not only oversaw things at Kodak, but there were various philanthropic endeavors here locally that he would always oversee. And almost as soon as the Rochester Dental Dispensary is established on Main Street and it's running on its own and it's successful, he immediately switches gears to music. And he was just like that. Once something was completed, it's on to something else. And the next big challenge for Eastman was making Rochester a better musical city. He has this great quote in January 19, "Music is one of the essentials of well-rounded life in our community." So the year starts musically with providing musical instruments for the Rochester City School District. The Board of Education approached Rochester in January asking for musical instruments. They didn't have the money, so Eastman obliges them, and he says, "I'll pay for up to $15,000 worth of instruments for the exclusive use of the children in school bands and orchestras." And Eastman had, the year before, he had purchased a struggling, failing music school in Rochester called the DKG Institute of Musical Art, and he had handed that over to be University of Rochester's music school. We know it as Eastman School of Music, but it wasn't named that yet. And so each of these instruments for the Rochester City School District kids was inscribed with the property of the School of Music, the University of Rochester, given by George Eastman. And that clarinet that you see there is actually another object that's out on display on the second floor. So go take a look at it, and you can see that inscription just barely on that clarinet. But, Eastman eventually outgrew the idea of his home being the home for this music school. So he looked around for available properties, and he settled on Main Street and Gibbs. And it was in 1919 that he officially approved the name Eastman School of Music, and he started an endowment fund. But 1919 was spent giving shape to the School of Music and to what became the Eastman Theatre. So when it came to the theater, Eastman had a radical idea. His idea was to devote the music hall, the theater, on East Main Street in Gibbs, to motion pictures. How many people knew that he established it for movies? Yeah. Oh, you guys are a smart crowd. That's great. So his initial plan was to use the profits from the box office to go to the orchestra, and movies would be 6 nights a week, and concerts would be 1 day a week. And he viewed it as, people would go to the movies, they would have this movie with live orchestral accompaniment, and it was kind of like a bait and switch then. People were going to go to see the movies, but their music knowledge was going to be elevated, and they were going to come to a new level of musical awareness and musical knowledge, which was very important to George Eastman. But the bait and switch was getting them in there for the movies, but to really let them be educated musically. And so it was not named Eastman Theatre yet. The working name at the time was the National Academy of Motion Pictures, but eventually they scrapped that title because they thought it was too snobby, and they just called it Eastman Theatre. But again, the idea was to attract people through movies and then to make a feature of the music there. So he spends the year, getting research, getting advice. The Peabody Conservatory of Music in Baltimore were his primary consultants. At the time, they were considered the best music school in the country. Eastman, of course, wanted to outdo them, so he consulted with them. And then he combined the best talent that he could find for the layout of the Eastman Theatre and the Eastman School of Music. Gordon and Kelber were his local architects. McKenzie and White were the New York City architectural firm that was looked at as the best architecture firm in the country. And then he also got the opinion of some acoustics people and some engineers. And it was this combining of talent that really gave shape to the School of Music and what became the Eastman Theatre. And I want to convey this afternoon that it got really heated in 1919. McKenzie and White, again, the best architectural firm in the country, their cooperation on that project was conditional upon the entrance to that theater being on Main Street. Eastman and Gordon and Kelber thought that it should be a corner entrance on the corner of Main Street in Gibbs. And it got really heated in 1919, so much so that by the end of 1919, McKenzie and White had just walked away from the project. They just withdrew. And early in 1920, it got hammered out and they came back on. But they came to this deadlock in 1919 over the entrance. And eventually they worked it out, but there's a lot of heated letters from 1919. So while that stuff was going on, the Eastman School of Music itself was making headway, even though they didn't have the permanent facility yet. They were hiring faculty, students were registering. Arthur Alexander was spending the year making plans for the new orchestra, and everyone just in Rochester was excited for this new wave of music that was coming Rochester's way. After letting go of Herman Dosenbach for his home music house, Eastman had a new quartet together, Arthur Hartman. It wasn't called the Kilbourne Quartet yet, but it became the Kilbourne Quartet, named after George Eastman's mother. But he liked changing housekeepers every once in a while. He liked changing chauffeurs every once in a while. He liked changing organists every once in a while. And this was just the musical switch that he wanted for 1919. It was a brand new quartet, and Arthur Hartman headed that up. We do have an album upstairs in our area that shows the work that went on at Main and Main Streets. So 1919 was just the demolition of the buildings that were previously there. We have a few shots of that, but that demolition began in the fall of 1919. So again, George Eastman's establishment of the Eastman School of Music was public knowledge. People knew about that. What wasn't known was the movie angle, the theater angle. And so when the National Association of Motion Picture Industry had their 3rd annual meeting in Rochester in August, Eastman hosted a dinner for them at the Genesee Valley Club. And it was at that event that he unveiled his plans for the $3.5 million gift, not only for the School of Music, but for the Film Center and the theater. And the place just erupted, and the newspapers erupted, and letters began streaming in from Rochesterians thanking Eastman for, some of them call it the Temple of Music that he's establishing in Rochester. So yeah, letters just start streaming in, and it's very neat to see in 1919. Starting in 1912, Eastman had given some financial gifts to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Some of those gifts he had done with his name attached to it. Other gifts he had given anonymously as quote-unquote Mr. Smith. And the guessing game persisted for years about the press was wondering who this Mr. Smith was. And Eastman threw them off by sometimes attaching his name, by sometimes using this mysterious name of Mr. Smith. And it was in the fall of 1919 that the press began to have the suspicion that it was really Mr. Eastman, just by the power of deduction. You know, so-and-so died, and they were kind of ruled out because MIT said it wasn't them. So eventually, the press just narrowed it down to Mr. Eastman, and they were correct. And it was actually in January 1920 that it was officially divulged that Mr. Eastman was Mr. Smith, and the great guessing contest of 8 years' duration came to an end. All right, Conservatory Expansion. So Eastman, by this point in 1919, had been in this mansion for 14 years. He and his mother moved in the summer of 1905. And if you've been in the mansion, you know that the centerpiece of it is the conservatory. Eastman never used the term conservatory. He called it the music room, or sometimes the palm room. But that music room in the center of his residence was too square. And after 14 years of living here and having this square music room, he decided to do something about it. He decided to ultimately have the house cut in two and to have the rear part of the house moved back 9 feet 4 inches on rollers. And the staff here, and Kathy and I, and the docents, we always say, because it's true, that it cost more to expand his house than it did to build the mansion in the first place. But when George Eastman wanted something, he got it. And so the house was cut in two, and then using rollers, they moved it back that 9 feet and 4 inches. It took 7 hours to push the house using jacks. Eastman was away on his Western camping trip while the house was moved, so he did have motion picture footage taken of the move, but it didn't turn out due to the changes of light during that 7 hours. But I really wish we had that moving image footage. But the actual firm that did the move was the Eichlein brothers down in Pittsburgh, and years later, in an article about all the cool things that company had done, they called the moving of George Eastman's house a rather odd job. He got what he wanted. So there's some pictures here for you to look at. So you see the track there underneath the house. What you're seeing there is the household staff porch, which is now essentially where the Dryden Theater is, but they moved it north just 9 feet 4 inches. There you see another shot of the same area, just from a wider angle. And then we've got a shot here from the other side, near the terrace garden. And you can see the men at work underneath it. But man, that was, and Eastman was pleased with it. The end result, the more rectangular music room in the heart of his house, he loved it. He was so pleased with it. And yes, he could fit more people in there for the musicals that he did every week. So going along with that, Eastman was very annoyed in 1919 by the squeaking and the creaking and the rattling from his organ. He did have better ears than Aunt Bethany in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. It wasn't a squirrel in the Christmas tree, it's the organ making all that music. So every other letter in where's Joe Blackburn? Every other letter in 1919 is just complaining to Aeolian about these noises. And you know, George Eastman spent a lot of money on his organ, he expanded the organ, and he wanted it to sound good. So there's just a lot of correspondence about complaining about these, you know, squeaking, creaking, and rattling. So one of the other things that he did in 1919 was he fired his previous organist. George Fisher was his organist for many years, but he started promoting himself as George Eastman's personal organist, and George Eastman didn't like that self-promotion with his name attached. So he gets rid of George Fisher, and again, that's something he'd like to do every once in a while, is just find new people. So in 1919, he hires Harold Gleason. Gleason comes to be his personal organist, waking him up at 7 a.m. every day with live music. Eastman would go downstairs, have his breakfast, read the newspaper, smoke a cigarette with that live music. And Harold Gleason stayed with him for a very long time, and not only came to Rochester to be his personal organist, but to head up the organ department at Eastman School of Music as well. I always enjoy talking about where George Eastman traveled to. Of course, George Eastman, one of his favorite places to go to was his rustic hunting retreat in North Carolina. It was very typical of him for him to go down there 3 times a year, January, the spring, and then Thanksgiving. And so he did that 3 times visits in 1919. At the time, Eastman was very consumed with his hog operation that he had going down there. He had spent a couple years buying the best Tamworth hogs and having them bred, and he had a hog slaughtering operation down there that he was very proud of, supplying meat. And remember, during World War I, there was meat rationing going on, so part of that was from a patriotic motivation to get more meat supply. But Eastman had this little quote here that he had high hopes that the hog operation would make even more money than Kodak. So. Another neat thing is that Eastman was giving shape in 1919 to another Eastman school. Here in Rochester, when we hear the term Eastman School, we automatically think of the School of Music. But down in North Carolina, where the African-American tenants lived on his Oak Lodge property, Eastman built a school for their children. He wanted their labor situation to improve. He wanted them not to be taken advantage of. He wanted them to get some real-life skills. So he spent the year giving shape to the North Carolina Eastman School. And there you see the Myrick family. Henry Myrick there on the right was his foreman at Oak Lodge that took care of the place while Eastman was away. And when you see the pictures of George Eastman and his, elite, rich, white friends that go down there, they love these kids. They're always scooping up the kids and holding them, and you can just tell there's a lot of affection. And Eastman wanted to give them good educational opportunities down there in North Carolina. Again, because he couldn't go to Europe as a result of the testimony that he had to give, Eastman did have to get away every now and then just with a quick motor trip for 2 or 3 days. In July, he and his good friends go on a 944-mile trip down to Pennsylvania, and they really meandered because it's not 400 miles there, it's like 200. So they did a lot of meandering along the way, and Eastman had a picnic outfit that would go perfectly into his Packard automobile. And they would just pull over on the side of the road and have a picnic, and they might show up at a farmhouse to ask for some milk and butter. But that's just how things were done back then. But Eastman really enjoyed driving around and motoring around. So every summer, Eastman usually went on a very rigorous camping excursion. He usually went on these big camping trips for 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time. And up until 1919, Eastman's favorite place to camp in the world was the Jackson Hole region of Wyoming. But starting in the World War I years, Eastman began to conclude that the area was getting settled too fast, that civilization was encroaching on the wild country, that there was very little space left to enjoy. And so, again, sticking with this theme of expansion, Eastman began looking for a new frontier. He began looking for a new place to camp. Eastman was always looking for good fishing, water, and timber, and after flirting with the idea of Idaho, eventually he decided on the Kootenay region of British Columbia. You can see from that picture there why he decided to go there. And Eastman only goes to Wyoming one more time, I think, for nostalgia's sake, but for his last full decade, when he goes out west to go camping, it's really to British Columbia and Alaska. He had found the really wild west, as he called it. So this is the region they went to in 1919. We don't have any pictures from this excursion. I wish we did. I always enjoy showing the summer camping trip photos. But his good friend took the pictures on this trip, and we don't have any. Eastman took a lot of pride in the fact that, according to him, no human being had been in that locality since the beginning of the war. So he took great pleasure in checking out this region where no human had stepped in about 5 years. So we don't have any pictures from that trip, but we do have his camping diary of camp locations. And in the back of this diary is also a list of recipes. And if you head to the second floor sitting room, there's actually an iPad there where you can swipe through and see some of his recipes. Get the recipe for macaroni and cheese. It's a good one. But through this diary, you see what a typical, wilderness life meal was. And a typical breakfast for Eastman out on the trail was grapefruit, bacon, coffee. A typical lunch was ham, pork, jelly cakes. Typical dinner was beef, hash, biscuits, and mince pie. I'm really making myself hungry. But yeah, a lot of those recipes, you can actually get those upstairs on that iPad. In 1919, Universal Pictures approached George Eastman wanting to make a movie about his life. And of course, George Eastman, who shuddered every time that he saw his name in print in a national magazine, he said, no, it's no surprise. But Eastman turned them down. He said, I'm not into that kind of thing. But that's an idea that's never gone away. I mean, sometimes we do get Hollywood screenwriters that approach us asking us, to come research to make a movie. Nothing has ever really happened, but there have been several starts and stops. But someday we'd love to have a motion picture made of George Eastman's life. D.W. Griffith, who was one of the more popular and, of course, controversial filmmakers of the early Hollywood era, he actually invited George Eastman to his Rochester premiere of his new movie, Broken Blossoms, in October 1919. George Eastman, this was his favorite movie at this point. Eastman loved this movie. He thought this film, more than any other film he had seen, really revealed the power of motion pictures. And especially as he was about to embark on this Eastman Theatre movie proposition, he thought this movie would really educate the masses on what motion pictures were capable of doing. If George Eastman had friends that were not fans of movies, he would recommend this movie. He would be, have you seen Broken Blossoms yet? So it's completely odd timing, just completely odd and coincidence. But that movie is playing at the Dryden Theater Tuesday at 7:30. So it's just a neat coincidence. But I would urge you to attend Tuesday at 7:30 and see George Eastman's favorite movie, at least his favorite movie in 1919. So the year ends, like most other years end, with a big New Year's party. He had a party on New Year's Eve for people his age, other prominent Rochesterians. They had 235 people, and they had Riccardo Stracchiari and Maggie Tate perform The Secret of Suzanne. And the following day, January 1st, he put on a young people's party for his grandnephew and grandniece, ages 17 and 15, who were here from Chicago. So he let them bring some of their young friends from Chicago, and then Eastman also invited 150 local boys and girls under the age of 18 to give them as good a time as possible, he says. So 2 parties, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. There is the conservatory set up for The Secret of Suzanne. I can't promise you that that's December 31st, 1919, because I think he did have that played here more than once. But then we also had this neat letter from his grandnephew, George Eastman Dryden. And in this letter he says, I want you to know what a perfect Christmas I had in Rochester. It was the most wonderful I have ever had anywheres. The young people party certainly was grand. I want to thank you for letting Oliver and I use the cars and for all those thousands of other things you did for us. The fur coat is just the article to wear here because it is so warm and it is so cold here. At the time he was going to school in Minnesota, and he loved that fur coat that he got from Uncle George. So here's a little preview of next year. We'll be examining, of course, 1920. And I think there's another theme here. I think the term that I'll use next year is the fun is in the game. And that's one of my favorite quotes about George Eastman, and it's in regard to just the working out of the details for the things that he was interested in. Of course, George Eastman was interested in the end result, the Rochester Dispensary, or the School of Music, or the Strong Hospital, but the fun for him was in the working out of all those details. And, is a very value-driven person. I kind like that part of George Eastman. I myself, if I'm not part of a band of people trying to better the community and brainstorming and hatching schemes, I need that in my life, and so I definitely relate to that part of Eastman as well. But the fun for him was in the game. It was the game of just working out all the details. So what was going on in 1920? He emerges as a national figure when he is revealed to be Mr. Smith. He takes his trip to Japan, which is his only trip to Asia. So we'll spend a good part of next year talking about his Japan trip and all the really neat souvenirs that he came back with. We're also going to explore the beginnings of the medical school at Strong Memorial Hospital, which is named after his mentor and investor who had just died. And the Rochester Dental Dispensary undergoes their first tonsillectomy marathon that year. He wanted to remove every childhood tonsil in Rochester. So that'll be a fun thing to talk about next year. And then flipping the script to talk about Kodak, it's in 1920 that they establish a chemical laboratory in Tennessee. During World War I, a lot of their chemicals and raw materials were too hard to find because they came from Europe. So a repercussion of that is trying to make their own raw materials and chemicals. And they did that in Tennessee. And then it's the centennial of the formation of ESL. So lots to be excited about. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to go on the second floor to the sitting room and check out the exhibit where many of these objects are on display. And like I said, there's an iPad there on the end where you can flip it and actually see those recipes. So I'll open it up to questions. Any questions? Yeah.
This isn't so much a question, but I think probably just two coincidences. The organist that was furloughed and then the new organist that came in, the outgoing organist, George Fisher, I think that was the same name as the CEO that was brought in.
That's true. It is, yeah.
And then the new organist was Gleason, like
Gleason works, right.
Across the other side of University Line.
Yeah.
I assume that's just another.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, Joe.
Okay, won't put you on the spot and expect you to know what the secret of Suzanne was, but I am kind of curious what her secret was.
Sounds like you know. Kathy, go ahead.
I don't. But
the secret is that she smoked, and because she was always leaving the room of her married home and coming back smelling like smoke, her husband thinks she's having an affair. And so it's this whole thing of trying to expose her, and in reality, she's just a
bless
smoker.
your heart, you knew the answer. Very timely 20s.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the, you were talking about hiring the young women for Kodak. I think that's great. What was the impetus gender equality, or was it because you felt that, men needed to have women in the workforce, or, what was his thinking along this line?
It's important to note that it was 100 years ago. Times were very different. I suspect it was the latter. And to be honest, I think they could pay them less money. That's my suspicion, can't prove it. But those kind of secretarial jobs that they needed, they just tended to hire women for them. So, yeah, this is my guess. Judy, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, anybody else? Yeah, there.
You hear about the expansion mentioned a lot, but we don't hear about any real problems or obstacles or damage caused. And it's hard to believe that they moved this whole half of the mansion, and didn't cause any damage to any of the structure.
I've never seen any correspondence that says anything was damaged. Eastman was just through the roof with the result. He had had 14 years of frustration with the square conservatory, and he was finally liberated and had more room for his guests. So I haven't heard any horror stories about it, but it's astonishing that they could move that part of the house.
I often wonder why he's single all this year and he was so popular.
Well, I mean, that's a frequent question that we get. I think early on, George Eastman was so consumed with photography that he just didn't have time for family life. And by the time he made it and was a millionaire, he figured that, women might have been after him for his money. He did have a young girlfriend, Susan Brown, who left Rochester to pursue music at Juilliard. And some people surmise that's one of his hidden motivations for making a school of music here later, so that Rochester wouldn't have to lose people like her. Close to his death, he got back in touch with Susan Brown, and they exchanged some really cool letters. But early on, I've seen many letters from Eastman in his early days when he's traversing Europe, and he's just remarking to his mother, "Oh, there's so many beautiful women over here." So I think early on, he was, very much, attracted to women and, had a girlfriend, but he just kind of pursued other things. And, as an introvert, as a famous introvert, he just kind of shied away from that kind of thing later in his life. Yep.
Didn't they have trouble getting some property on Main Street for the School of Music? Did that does that happen in 1919?
Yeah, it's in 1919 that there's some building, I can't say who it was or who owned it, but some building like right on that spot that they would sell to Eastman for a price that Eastman thought was way too expensive. So he said, all right, we're just going to have to fit it here where it is. And, that frustrated everybody, particularly McKim, Mead and White, making this grand theater on this little kind of awkward position spot. And it is kind of an awkward spot, but I think they did it marvelously. So I look forward to the centennial in 2022. Lots to celebrate coming up in the years ahead.
Yeah. They eventually got it back. I mean, now there's something built.
Oh,
on
yeah,
that
yeah.
spot that corresponds with the Eastman Theatre.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Marion?
Yeah, I was wondering about the Eastman Community School for Music. How did that fit into the story?
The community?
The Community School for Music? Is this a new word, new concept?
For me, Kathy.
Well, the community school that they have now is a separate sort of entity and stuff, but I don't know if they had one for the community before. Sibley Music Library used to be a lone library school. Kids could go there and actually borrow music and whatever, so it was more of a center area where people who wanted to learn an instrument, wanted to sing, could borrow things. But the actual community music school that they now have, I don't think that concept existed back then.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah?
Not a question, but I have, you probably have one here, the program from the grand opening of the Eastman Theatre.
Yeah.
And in reading through it, one of the features it describes of the theater was being able to project movies with the house lights on, for the purpose of avoiding the moral hazard of people sitting in the dark.
I think I've seen that. I think I've seen some correspondence about lighting experts being called in. Yeah, it took a lot of even C.E. Kenneth Peace was involved with some of that lighting research.
I noticed the lights are on in here.
That's why. Yeah, go ahead.
So, after Henry Armstrong died,
Yeah.
Eastman became president of Kodak. When did he actually retire? 65,
It's either 24 or 25 that he.
25.
Yeah, 25 he retires. Yeah.
Okay, so he retired at 71.
Yeah. Yeah. Jim.
In the days before Megabus, how did George Eastman get back and forth to New York when he was going all those times? And do you know where he stayed?
The train, obviously, is how we got there.
No chauffeur driven?
No, not when he needed to get there quicker. And it was very common for him to get a night train and just show up at New York in the morning, that's how I do it when I go down to New York City. I just take a bus at night. But I think the Belmont, is there a Belmont down there? Yeah, that name rings a bell. Yeah.
Supposedly, the Eastman Kodak Company commissioned some author to write a book either about George Eastman or Kodak, which was never published.
Yeah.
Do you have access to that book?
We have, so there were 2 or 3 potential biographies that Kodak had sort of commissioned, and there were researchers that had access to George Eastman's letters back in the 50s. Oscar Soler himself did all these oral interviews, and for whatever reason, I can't tell you why, but they never went through with publishing of those articles. One author, Roger Butterfield, did a lot of research. We have his notes, we have his transcriptions of letters, but the final result of his work was just a centennial publication in 1954 for Life magazine on George Eastman. And it's a great article, but it doesn't replace, the biography that could have been, because he did a lot of research.
Where are these materials sitting?
So we have the Butterfield in our collection, and U of R has some other materials.
The Brummett manuscript.
Yeah, that's the other name, Brummett, yeah. Oh, over here.
You mentioned the head of the Kodak Research Department, Z. Lees.
Yep.
Do you know how long he was there at Kodak?
Oh, he was there for a long time. Yeah, how long was Mies there for? Do you know?
Todd, can you help us? I'm not exactly, oh, Bob, can you help us?
He came to the United States in the summer of 1912.
Right.
And started the research lab at that point.
Yeah.
He died in 1960. When did he retire? He retired to Hawaii, by the way.
Yeah.
And there's a solar telescope there with his name on it.
Oh,
In Hawaii.
My grandfather was the general contractor to build the house. And I was always under the impression that they didn't get the job to move the house. But when you wrote the description of this, it said it gave that company, you know.
Are you related to the Friedrichs?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think the Friedrichs had anything to do with the conservatory expansion. I do think Eastman liked kind of giving different jobs to different people, and I know I've seen a letter from Mrs. Friedrich where she's pleading with Eastman, please hire my husband, but Eastman sets out the reasons that, you know, and it's not because he's mad at Mr. Friedrich or anything like that, it's just that he wanted to divvy it up, so to speak. But yeah, come in sometime and I'll show you that letter. Any other questions? Yeah?
What became the Eastman School of Music, it was the ECG or whatever it was,
Yes.
Institute of
Yes.
Musical Art. Juilliard used to be called the Institute of Musical Art. Well, that when you mentioned the woman that moved away.
Yeah.
But what was, how long have they been around, or what's the background with them?
Man, Lisa Clement, are you here? Lisa's not here. Do you know Kathy?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Can you elaborate on the DKG Institute of Musical Art and how long they were around before going floundering?
We have a big file folder on them in the collection, and they were around for quite a long time in Rochester, but were not doing very well, which is why Mr. Eastman bought them pretty cheap and then ended up making the Eastman School.
Yeah.
Did they have dormitories and stuff, or was it just, you know, afternoon less practice sessions?
I think they had a mansion or a house, you know, near downtown that the Elf Klingenberg operated. But yeah, I don't know the size of it or how
So
long.
it's sort of like what the Eastman School was going to be like when it was going to be here.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned this. Does anybody remember what swept through America in 1918 when we talked about it? The Spanish flu, that's right. And I remember, you know, Eastman in this 1918 letter and this 1919 letter talks about how he doesn't think he has much longer left. And I did find a letter where Eastman's personal physician, Edward Mulligan, has a suspicion that Eastman caught like a tail-end minor case of the Spanish flu, and it does stay with him, because most of 1919, and certainly in 1920, Eastman is complaining about his throat all the time, some laryngitis, a severe cold that will not go away, so much so that he actually considers not going to Japan the following year. But Dr. Mulligan's suspicion is that Eastman caught a little bit of that Spanish flu, and just kind of hung on and wouldn't let go for a while. So. Yeah?
Yeah, you've mentioned quite often that you've read a lot of Eastman's letters. Are there still a lot that you've never seen?
So when I spent 3.5 years cataloging George Eastman's letters in our collection, and just when you're looking at 49,804 letters, you don't have time to read them all. But so I indexed them. I wanted to make a definitive record of what we had in our collection. So I made note of the date of the letter, whether it was handwritten or typed, how many pages it comprised, who wrote it, and then I quickly just skimmed the letter just to see what they're talking about. So I didn't have, it was not within the scope of the project to read every letter. And Kathy always teases me that I get to read letters all the time, which I would quirk with a little bit. But yeah, so I skimmed them just to see what the letter was about and created a really good finding aid that has revolutionized how people do the research. But it's our goal to put those online, so I won't be the only one looking at those things, so stay tuned. That's the goal, yeah. They've already started photographing them, so we'll see. Any other questions? All right, thanks everybody.